Now we are starting the new topic. The topic is fiscal and monetary policy and the long-term perspective on policy making by framing policies in a dynamic context. So the reading is chapter 24, 25, and 26 of blank card, right? So we are talking about various kinds of policy mix here. And it is starting with a very interesting question. I'm starting with chapter 24. And it is saying that if you look at macro models, then you have the range of macro models. The outcomes which are given by these macroeconomic models, uh, they could be very different from each other. And the policymakers, when they are deciding the policies, they are looking at the historical data. They are looking at the macroeconomic econometric models, and they're looking at the outcomes of these models. And the outcomes of these models are giving you the range of solutions. So you tweak the assumption a little bit, you may get a different solution. The little bit another data or another assumption, it can give the different solution. So there is an uncertainty which is involved in these macro models. So if there is an uncertainty involved in the macroeconomic models, then what policies policymakers should adopt? Should they have a very active policy making based on these models, and or should they do little less than what these models are saying? That is what we are interested in. And secondly, how can we be sure that the policy makers will also be doing the right thing also? Even if the macro model is saying you the correct thing to do, can we be sure that the policy makers will actually be doing the right thing? That's an idea of this chapter. So I'm starting with chapter 24, and uh, it starts by saying this, that given the uncertainty, please write alongside. Given the uncertainty about the effects of monetary policy, let's say monetary policy here, and the subsequent chapters are going to see monetary policy and fiscal policy separately also, chapter 25 and 26. Monetary policy or fiscal policy. So here we are talking in general about the policy. Would it not be better not to use any policy at all, right? And supposedly we can use the right policy also. How can we be sure that the policy makers would also be doing the right thing? But that is the point of the next class. So I'm just putting it right now. Even if we can use the policy, can we trust the policy makers to carry out the right policy? To carry out the right policy. Can we actually trust that? And then Blanket goes on to say this. He says that supposedly central bank wants to increase the output by the use of expansionary monetary policy. And he says this, then don't you think that there are series of questions, series of linkages will start, and the policymakers would have to know the answers to all of these questions. So suppose. So right now, what is it that we are going to show is that there are series of events, series of linkages, which will start by just one kind of policy. So policymakers would have to know the answers to all of these questions. And policymakers will be relying on the macro models for the answers to these questions. Macro models will be relying on how these linkages have behaved in the past, right? So there is, and the macro models, just based on the data or some assumptions, they can give very different range of answers. Now, when it can give very different range of answers, then there is an uncertainty about these macro models, right? So should we be using these models to go ahead with the policy? That's an idea. So please write, suppose. So I'll be doing the second part in the next slide, but the first one, and we're trying to answer the first one. Suppose central bank wants to increase output. And for that, it increases money supply. It does so. Just imagine your ISLM curve. Your LM curve is shifted downwards, output increases, right? But then there are many questions which central bank has to answer, and few of them are, you're increasing output, fine. By an increase in output, employment will increase, yes. Unemployment will fall, yes. Then do you know that whether you were sitting at the natural level of employment or you were above or below natural level of employment? It's the first question which you would want to answer. Because if you are, in case if you reduce the unemployment much, then there is going to be the inflationary pressures in the economy. How will you tackle that? So that's the question which you have to answer. So if it increases money supply, output will increase. Unemployment will fall. But the question is, will it be above or below the natural level of unemployment, right? Will it be above the natural level of employment or it will be below the natural level of employment? That's a question which you need to answer. That's a question which you need to answer. Well, if it is really below the natural level of employment and you have reduced the unemployment further, then this is going to lead to an increase in prices. So you started by solving one problem, but you created the another problem for yourself. Then, when LM curve is going to shift downwards, your output is increasing, but you also know that interest rate is also going to fall. How is this short-term fall in interest rate going to be linked with the long-term changes in the interest rate? That's another question which you want to answer, right? If money supply increases, how much rate of interest will fall, and how much this short-term fall in the interest rate is going to affect the long-term rate of interest. How will this affect long-term rate of interest? This is the another thing. Then, bhaiya, your rate of interest has fallen. Your country is an open economy. When the interest rate is going to fall relative to the foreign country, then don't you think there is going to be the depreciation in your country? Don't you have to answer that question also? So there are so many linkages which are happening at the same time. So by how much? Currency will depreciate. Now, when the currency depreciation is going to happen, don't you think that the J curve is going to take place? J curve effect is going to take place. How much time it is actually going to take place for people to realize that the exchange rate has changed? These are the questions which you need to answer. So how long? Will it take? For the J curve effects, to work themselves out. And for trade balance to improve. So you remember now, when the depreciation is going to happen, the first effect is going to be on the prices. The first effect is going to be on the prices, and then the quantity effect is going to take place. Ultimately, I mean, first of all, the people will realize that, yes, the prices have changed. But then they will take some time to realize that, yes, now they have to find out the cheaper sources of supply for exports and imports, right? The foreign firms and the domestic firms, they'll try to find out the cheaper sources of the supply, because now the relative prices have changed. That is what the J curve is. And ultimately, if the Marshall conditions are holding, then the exports will increase enough and imports will fall enough for the trade balance to improve. Trade balance is your net exports, exports minus imports. Yeah. So just by one policy, you can see there are so many linkages which are coming. So many linkages, right? And policymakers will be relying on the specific macroeconomic models for the answers to these questions. And with a little tweaking of the assumptions in these macroeconomic models, the range of solutions can be very different. No? And these macroeconomic models will depend upon the data, how these variables, they have behaved in the past. And then they will be giving solutions that, yes, this is going to be the effect, this is going to be the effect. And generally, no two models are going to give you the same solution, right? So there'll be the series of solutions, there'll be the range of solutions which will be coming. And because you have the range of solutions, you have the uncertainty which is there. No? So policymakers rely on specific macroeconometric models. Uh, and the equations in these models show how these links have behaved in the past, right? But the problem is that the models can lead to different answers, right? Uh, but the problem is that these models can lead to different answers. So don't you think that if the models can lead to different answers, there is a substantial uncertainty in these models? So should we rely on these models? That's an idea. Okay, forget about relying on this model. I mean, should we actually take up the policy based on the solutions of these models, or we should take up the average of the different models? So one thing is certain, you can't just depend upon one particular model. You will have to take up the several models, and you try to do even little lesser than what has been told to you by the model, because you never know about any of these things with certainty. There are the forecasts which are available, but you don't know with certainty any of these things. So there is an uncertainty which is related to the macro models. So there is substantial uncertainty. There is substantial uncertainty about the effects of the policy, right? Uh, so, so the question which we are trying to answer is, if there is an uncertainty which is related with the macro models, then should we do exactly as what has been told by these models? Or should we take these models with a pinch of salt and try to do less? When I say we, I mean policymakers. So should policymakers do exactly what has been told by the models, or should try to do little less than what models have predicted? So we will see in the next class with an example that policymakers should actually try to do little less than what models have predicted. That's rather better, right? That's rather better. And we will sort of introduce the concept of what is the fine tuning out here. Huh? So this is what I want to do in this class. I'll take the discussion further tomorrow, beta. Thank you.